Oh,
Let me
yeah.
just do a quick. Sorry, I want to just see where our. If we get over to the Prudentialist, click on you. I just want to throw out a going live now tweet on
Oh,
this.
many such cases. Let me go fix. Yeah, one of those things that just we need to always do is to tell people, "Hey, we're live." It's sometimes I'm terrible at doing that on my own channel. I don't do that enough. Um, but yeah, no, I think that this will be a fun discussion, no matter what. I think I may have hit gone live a little early, but hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome. I have one of my favorite people to talk to on geopolitical affairs, my good friend Oliver Semiogogue. How are you, sir?
I am well, but I am actually hearing you twice, so I'm going to have to figure out why. So, as you
Do you have the YouTube tab open on the other side with the stream?
there it is. That wretched extra tab. My apologies. Boomer moments, unprofessional garbage. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, sir. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to shoot a tweet out to tell everybody, as we were just talking about, that I am going live with you, or I have gone live, and hopefully we'll get the people in here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you had already done a stream, and I think as some of us have already sort of been aware, there was a military coup of sorts in the African country of Niger, located in the Sahel region, so just right below the Sahara Desert, that has been prominent with former colonial countries and territory that also has a large Western military presence. This junta took and removed the president of that country, democratically elected. You can take that for what you will. That was pro-Western on a nominal side, and this military junta has, put out a plan to transition for power. They've told the French to get out, and so we're sort of seeing this part of the world, with a renewed interest. But you had done a stream not too long ago, sort of covering this issue, and I thought that maybe you could bring us up to speed for the audience before we look into the new news as well.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, I am seldom as prepared as you are, if truth be told. And anyone watching this it's the case, who follows me and isn't already subscribed to Fruit's channel, please do so. It's great resource for geopolitics, strategy, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that out of the way, and thank you for having me. Basically, there's a coup, but there are coups in this part of the world all the time, literally all the time. I believe, according to the BBC, there were 21, and in 2021, there were 6 coup attempts in Africa overall, 4 of them successful. Certainly successful ones in the region include April of 2021 in Chad, sort of, but that was to install the son of the person who had been running it for quite some time anyway. 24th of May, 2021 in Mali, 5th of September, 2021 in Guinea, 30th of September, 2022 in Burkina Faso. So basically, coups are how governments change in this region. So there was a coup in Niger. The president's the presidential guard detained the democratically elected president Mohamed Bazoum, and the commander of the presidential guard Abdurrahmane Chiani proclaimed himself leader. The deposed president is apparently an Arab from Libyan tribe with branches in Chad and in northeastern Niger. So what we have here is an Arab from up in the North African regions who's come down and done the thing of dominating a population that is in large part not, of the same descent he is, which is something that people in that region care about. You've got that kind of thing going on, I believe, in Nigeria, or have had it at times with Hausa and Fulani and the rest. So there's a typical thing where the herders come down from the north and impose themselves on populations in these southern regions. And I think that is the case that we're dealing with here in Niger. So the deposed president's ethnic group apparently makes up less than 0.5% of the population, and they're considered foreigners, and they are resented. One of the justifications given for the coup was that people are upset that the jihadist attacks are not being reduced and the rest. And there's also the idea that definitely, as you well know, Prude, an anti-colonial narrative, and the whole idea of former French colonial territories that extend all across this area of Western Africa. Obviously, these countries where many of the people speak French, in addition to whatever their own tribal languages are. Otherwise, there's just a little bit of sort of background information. Mali and Burkina Faso, which, as we just noted, also had their own coups, apparently are standing side by side, at least to a certain extent, with Niger. They are this has been much touted in the news, so everyone's heard about this. Apparently, the thinking goes that, and it makes sense, it's entirely plausible that if there is an intervention from these other African states, and they're in sort of an odd political union called ECOWAS, well, putatively economic union that is in fact a regional political bloc coming into shape, along with its sort of other dimension, which is the Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group. So you've got ECOWAS that everybody talks about, but ECOMOG is the one that likes to get up in your business and do interventions. But the basic idea is that Mali and Burkina Faso are concerned that if the precedent is set with this intervention in Niger, that they will they'll be next up. And so I believe in the last few days, you probably know better than I, there was some announcement by Niger that they would permit Malian and troops from Burkina Faso to cross the border to support them and to enter the country in the event of military conflict. The only other thing we should really bear in mind, and then I'll turn it over to you so you can figure, you could tell me what parts you want to hear more about, what parts you have your own thoughts on that you want to share. But Algeria is very, very important in terms of access to this landlocked country. Algeria currently has very strong relations with Russia. Historically, Russia was a major security partner for Algeria, an economic partner, basically going back to the point when Algeria got independence in the 1960s. In 2022, if I'm not mistaken, there was fuss in U.S. Congress about Algeria agreeing to an arms deal that would involve Russia supplying them with $7 billion in weapons, including fighter jets, Su-57s, air defense systems, and more. So Algeria is increasingly aligned with Russia, and they have come out publicly and said that they do not support military intervention in this area. And that matters when you look at the maps, because one of the big issues is how you get how you get things into Niger from the outside world, since it's landlocked and it's an inhospitable country and its infrastructure is very limited. This could be very important. Now, the road, I made notes about it. I have to go dig them up, but yeah, I believe it takes, if you're lucky, 2 full days of uninterrupted driving to get from Algeria down to Niamey, which is the capital of Niger. So it's not, and that's by truck. So it's not like this is a great alternative, but at least it is one. Whereas Niger, another one of the surrounding countries, a keystone in the region, a keystone of ECOWAS, the largest population, one of the wealthiest countries due to its energy exports, fairly in Western pockets, and with a big population, a big military, they would be front and center for any military intervention. What they've done is they've cut off electricity to Niger, and they have also apparently cut traffic to a considerable extent. And that matters. There are other countries that matter other than Burkina Faso and Mali. Guinea forms kind of a link in a chain of these coup countries that could basically give them all access to the sea. If there were the infrastructure there, and this is important, if all of the infrastructure was there, and some of it is with roads that go a certain distance, and then you have to ship it onto a barge and then carry it down to the next bit of road. But you can, and in future more effectively could, get all the way from Niger across Mali and Burkina Faso over to the Atlantic via Guinea, and you could go north through Algeria to the Mediterranean. And there is certainly some discussion going on with the possibility that Chad is next in line. There's a French analyst who follows things in North Africa very, very closely, who has published some articles recently saying that Chad is next up. Um, and already there is a civil war in Sudan, and that civil war has an element of Russian participation, and it kicked off almost immediately after Sudan signed a deal to allow a big naval base in on the Red Sea there, if I'm not getting my geography mixed up. So the reason I point this out is because with Niger and Mali and Guinea, you could reach the Atlantic. Up from Niger to Algeria, you could reach the Mediterranean. And if the Russians managed to have picked the proper parties to back in Sudan, you could see something with that Red Sea access, which would get you out into the Indian Ocean. And so you would, ironically enough, have a kind of 3 Seas initiative in terms of access to these bodies of water that could do something with this region. There's a last point here I should throw in. Is it possible for me to share my screen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me see if I can present this. Pull up the right one. These are maps that were kindly provided to me by Jimmy Thomas, whose channel I hope you won't mind me recommending, Prude.
Oh, no, I recommend him all the time. He's great.
Yeah, he has considerable expertise with the military and logistics. He was kind enough to generate and share these maps with me, because you will play hell trying to get maps of roads and infrastructure in this region. And here we can see that there's a.
Do you want to try and zoom in down a little bit there, Oliver?
Oops.
On the map?
Yeah, I did it on the wrong window. I swear I'm not a boomer. Okay,
No.
So the black lines are paved roads. The red lines are highways. So you can see there's really a dearth of proper. Now that's rendered right, so we can see it better. There's a real limit on proper highways in this region, meaning divided lane, blacktop roads. So these are just, in theory, paved roads. So you can see Niger, has one road going up into Algeria, one road going up into Libya, and there's not much going east-west. What there is runs along this southern section. So there would seem to be an enormous opportunity for these countries and their development to have some sort of east-west corridor developed here, but we don't see it. Now, here's a second map, again, kindly provided by Jimmy Thomas. Again, I have to recommend him. Here you can see the map shows this is supposedly highways. So well-developed ones and partial or incomplete ones. And again, you just see there's not much going on here. What there is going on in Niger is in the south, right on the border with Nigeria, that makes it a situation where it's particularly susceptible to a Nigerian intervention, because all this infrastructure that has to do with all the transit here is right across the border. And we can see here the kind of points I was trying to make about rivers. So Jimmy Thomas was kind enough to include rivers on the map, being a great guy. So you can see here, if my cursor is showing up, that there's a section where you could come in through Guinea on the highways, and then the highways end, and you can pick it up with river transit, and then come around and get picked up with this limited highway development in Niger. But the main reason I wanted to point this out, though, is because there's a big band of very poor countries here that occupy a strategic position in terms of access to sub-Saharan resources to places like Europe. And we should all remember that Europe and North Africa, Europe and Africa, head by our masters, our wise masters in places like New York, London, Washington, D.C., and Brussels. They have determined that Europe should be basically made into an economic bloc with Africa as a kind of basis for resources. So if you were to create an east-west corridor here that linked these countries together, and you were to wrest it from French control in large part in the east, and the other colonial powers that still get involved here, the countries like Russia and China could apparently do very well. in terms of this corridor becoming a logistical chain. I'm hearing that I have a mic problem.
Are you using? I don't think you're plugged in on your good mic. I think you might be using your camera mic.
Oh, it's coming through the Bluetooth. Oh, curses! My apologies. The wrong one. Good God in heaven, why is this not showing up? Okay, well, I don't want to.
You're good now. You sound great. I mean, you sounded fine to me. I had no problem.
It's not even my good mic though. It's the crappy MacBook mic. But let's just stick with that so I don't.
Yeah, you sound good.
Sorry, apologies.
I've made that mistake many a time before, but don't worry. I also say it. Someone's asking like, why are we Frenchifying the pronunciation? Probably to avoid letting everyone else having fun with other words that start with N on this channel. So, no, this is good resources or the maps are, because one of the things that I wanted to bring up was 3 key issues, and the first one is of course French connection. The second being China's foreign direct investment, and the third one being U.S. Africa. Those are the 3 things that I really wanted to sort of dig in with you, because one of the things that came out of this coup was the French concern that we were going to see an increase in uranium prices, because there is a company that is French in Niger that mines uranium, and they are a direct competitor with the Chinese. According to Reuters, this was earlier at the end of July, they had said China's foreign direct investment into Niger stood at $2.68 billion USD at the end of 2020, according to the United States Embassy reports. Following in China's main investments in the country, predominantly the state energy giant PetroChina, which is one of the largest oil pipelines in that region, and its national nuclear firm CNNC. And so something seriously to consider. Also, the long-term relationship between China and the Sahel region has been growing. PetroChina has been investing in Niger since 2011. I think there is the Agadem oil field is what it's called, and it has been the largest sort of producer for oil there. There's a joint venture between the government of Niger and the Chinese. We have to keep in mind that Africa, since the 2000s and onward, China has been the largest foreign direct investor inside of the continent. So we're not even just talking about specific countries. We're talking about the area as a whole. There's been joint venture projects ranging from Ethiopia to Sudan, and PetroChina has been heavily involved in the Sahel region as well, which anytime that there's foreign direct investment, it's usually not solely for economic purposes. There's going to be a security detail in mind for this, and the great game is being played there. And there was an article by former Ambassador Alberto M. Fernandez, who is on Twitter. He's actually a really good guy to follow. For some reason, he follows me. But he wrote this article called The Great Game in the Sahel, which was published about 2 weeks ago. And he had said that the big things that you want to consider are the oil pipeline networks that also are part of Europe and Africa. So I'm going to pull up that map, and I'm going to zoom in real quick so we can all see it, because I think that this is an important thing to consider, is the energy sector and the European connection that we have here. So we'll share this one on screen, and there we go. So these are the pipeline networks that are in Africa to Europe. So you've got the planned Nigal pipeline. You've got various ones that are currently offline and various ones that are still on construction and still being developed, alongside various liquid natural gas terminals and ports that you can ship these off to instead of transporting via there. So if we put that in comparison to your maps that you had on just earlier, you're kind of seeing this north-south thing, not seeing a lot of particularly strong infrastructure outside of oil pipelines, and having to go around instead and dealing with shipping and traffic like that. So this is why having access to countries like Mauritania or having a good diplomatic relationship with Morocco and Algeria is so important. And you can already see just this entire section of former French colonial territory that, France is playing the foreign policy game here. When we talk about in other contexts, like the sort of the interpolitical dimensions of Europe and the European Union. Every time that we saw Angela Merkel and President Macron talk about like a European army, it was always those two powers. sort of that old Franco-Germanic rivalry coming up again. But France, out of all the European powers, probably has the most independent and robust like foreign policy as well as defense structure and apparatus inside of the continent. And they're heavily invested in this area because, they may have been officially decolonized, but the economic relationship is still there in 2023. And so to lose access to a country whose currency is tied to you, the country of Niger utilizes, I think, what's called the West African franc, and that is, of course, tied directly to the West African franc, CFA, and it's it's used by 8 countries, including Niger. It's also used by the Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Benin, and Burkina Faso. That region, of course, has, I think, a combined GDP, from what I read, only 150 billion USD. So it's not a particularly strong currency. It's a strong relationship to the French. It has a central bank of West African states, BCEAO, which of course all based in France, or has a French language. It's tied to the France there, and so it's meant to be a way to reduce France's role in their currency and their economy. But as we can see from how much influence it's got there, it's permanently pegged where the euro is about 660 of these West African francs. So we see this background for economic investment and interest to be playing here. And I think that it's kind of important when we talk about that, because when we look at, say, the discourse over, neo-colonialism or whatever, you see a lot of this sort of knee-jerk third worldist reaction, or we're rejecting the chains of global Western colonial capital, and it's just exchanging one hand of masters for another, because like I mentioned earlier, the largest foreign direct investment is in the continent is from China, more so than France's in this region, at least when it comes to energy. And these are the things that I think are important to keep in the backdrop as we dive in here. But before I go any further, is there anything that you want to add in here?
Yeah, just a quick point. First off, I've been trying to figure out to a certain extent how much, to what extent China has penetrated economically, economic relationships, energy relationships, and the rest. Some of these countries, one of the ones that they seem to be doing the best with is Mauritania, which doesn't seem to have much of a relationship with Russia at this point, though it doesn't seem like they're opposed or have any problem with Russia. But if you begin to include Mauritania as well, I don't know if we can we go back to the Africa map I had up on the
absolutely, go ahead. I can bring that up at the stream. There we go.
Yeah, because you should be able, let me see if my pointer's showing. You see that the Guinea is one of the ones that had one of these recent coups, and Mali and Burkina Faso as well. So you can see how it sort of moves inwards. And Algeria came over to the Russian side of things. Niger, let's not say that they're on the Russian side of things, but they're moving out of the French orbit. China is over here with a very strong economic relationship in Mauritania, which sort of opens up possibilities, right? If you were forced to funnel through here in Guinea, Guinea's a small country, and you could certainly get naval forces off its coast to blockade it, which makes it a much simpler matter to kind of shut things down there. But if Mauritania came online as well, now you have options for reaching the Atlantic. And I wanted to point out that for this region here, let me drop this back and get back over to my notes. In 2021, I've only found one reference. Well, there are 2 or 3 references, but they all go back to one article. But there was talk of a Trans-Sahel railroad, and a feasibility study was completed. And the idea was to link Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. And that was the idea at the time. Now we have the whole business of Russia signing the contract to set up a naval base in Sudan, which would basically provide port facilities and military protection for it to, carry, shipping, heavy shipping of resources or energy out of this region, and thereby increase the economic viability and potential of an entire logistical corridor if it was built there. Now, this was supposedly going to be done with assistance from Russia and China. Now, that was back in 2021. The Sudan signed the base deal with Russia and then suddenly erupted into civil war. I'm sure it was just a coincidence. Chad is the one that is the missing link in this east-west chain that the Russian experts or expert was talking about. Let me see if I've got his name here and I can mention it. I'll find it before the end of the stream just so I can, give credit to him. But this suggests that there's the possibility of this east-west logistical chain going through. And as we know from looking at like the battles in Ukraine going on right now, railroad lines are a very difficult thing to cross because they form a sort of parapet across this distance. And if your defensive positions are placed well ahead of them, it becomes a logistical chain that allows you to monitor, police, supply the rest of this region. So a railroad running east-west that had Chinese and Russian backing would no doubt act as a kind of parapet between Europe and resource-rich sub-Saharan Africa. I just think this needs to be hammered as a point. The last thing, and I'll turn it over to you, Prud, thank you for your patience, is that we see that one argument that can be made about what's going on with the Ukraine and Europe and what I believe the Duran guys first called the deindustrialization of Germany is that the United States, NATO powers are perfectly happy to come in and just screw Germany. They're absolutely perfectly happy to screw Germany. So while on the one hand, there are tantalizing signs that Russia and Germany and Russia and China in some combination could be playing some role to establish an east-west corridor here. We also have to recognize that the United States is perfectly happy to just crush Germany. They're absolutely just crushing them economically here. So is it really that difficult to imagine that maybe you could see a situation here where the U.S. and other Western powers are perfectly happy to chisel a huge chunk off of France and whittle it down to size? As you were talking about earlier, France and Germany are both these keystone pillars of or keystones and pillars of the economic and military power of Europe to whatever extent it has it without U.S. support. France has a very strong navy, nuclear weapons, and an interesting nuclear weapons doctrine that maintains a certain amount of sovereignty for it and independence. So the reason I bring this up, I know it sounds crazy because then it would seem as though, China, Russia, or certainly China and the U.S. could be cooperating here. If you take a look at Libya, as you well know, Prude, Khalifa Haftar, who is backed by Egypt and Russia and France, interestingly enough, is against the so-called government of national unity over on the other side of Libya with Tripoli. They're based, the Haftar side is over in Benghazi. The so-called government of national unity with the UN mandate that expired years ago is
funny
based,
how that works.
Is based over on the other side and is backed by Italy and the UN and the US. But here's the crazy thing. Haftar, who's the strong man aligned with Egypt and Russia, he's got 3 kids living in Northern Virginia and is known to be a U.S. government asset. So there's some, and he's had over on his side, Wagner mercenaries come in and assisting him, whereas over on the other side, Turkey sends plausible deniability mercenaries from Syria to back the other side in the Libyan conflict. So it's a very, very tangled mess that doesn't fit national interests entirely. It more aligns with economic blocs, corporations, and economic interests. But given that what I just mentioned about Haftar, which is Libya is involved as a bordering nation that could in potential provide access to Niger, and Russia, supposedly from Russian sources, is interested in being able to get down to Niger through Libya. In addition to all of that, we have the fact that many of these coup leaders across the Sahel region who've just successfully undertaken coups were a long line of, as the Intercept here puts it, a long line of U.S. trained mutineers. So I believe the coup leaders in Niger and one of them over in Burkina Faso or in Mali, they actually just met each other recently, or fairly recently, with U.S. training exercises in the last few years, which is how they first came to know each other. So this is a very weird situation going on. And I'm not saying it's the case that Russia is behind these series of coups. That was my favorite hypothesis last time. They could be economic interests. It could be that Russia and China are trying to do something, but it could also be that this suits the U.S. Very much to just rip all of this economic stuff from France. Let me just throw this last piece, and I swear I'll be quiet. Here we go. U.S. throws France under the bus after Niger coup. So you've got this guy, Konrad Yakubuski, published 11 hours ago, talking about how the U.S. is throwing France under the bus. So France is saying that that it's a coup and it's terrible and they can't tolerate it, but the U.S. apparently is stopping short of saying that it's a coup, and is stopping short of ceasing aid, and is stopping short of pulling out its troops. So your guess is as good as mine, sir. Thank you for your patience.
Well, I'm kind of glad that you tipped it off there with the U.S. military, or at least the USG in general, because I was doing some research and I'm familiar enough with U.S. AFRICOM to, I was like, I remember that there was a lot of drone stuff during the Obama administration in Africa and a lot of special forces stuff that carried over into the Trump administration. So I just started doing some reading, and I'm going to share this article from our friends over at well, I can't say that they're our friends, but at least our people that do research for us. And this is from The Nation. This is from 2015. It says the U.S. military's best kept secret. For years, American military expansion in Africa has gone largely unnoticed thanks to a deliberate effort to keep the public in the shadows. That's innately true. But I put Google in a Control F Niger in there. Special Forces soldiers demonstrates how to detain a suspect during Flintlock 2014, a U.S.-led international training mission for African militaries in Diffa, Niger. We've got a long presence here. And so the article that I wanted to bring up was that we've spent quite a bit of money since this issue. For years, various reporters have shed light on various hush-hush outposts, most of them built, upgraded, or expanded since 9/11, dotting the continent, these so-called cooperative security locations. Earlier this year, AFRICOM Commander General David Rodriguez disclosed that there are actually 11 such sites. Again, devoted AFRICOM watchers knew that this, too, was just the start of a larger story. But when I asked AFRICOM for a larger list of bases and other campsites, as I periodically have done, I was treated like a sap. In all, AFRICOM has access to 11 CSLs across Africa. Of course, we have one major military facility on the continent, Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. Of course, their foreign public affairs chief said. But he and I both knew perfectly well at best this was misleading. It's one of the most troubling aspects of our military policy in Africa and overseas generally that the military can't be and seems totally resistant on being honest, transparent about what it's doing, says David Vine, author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. But research from Tom, and again, this is from 2015, so this is almost, we're 8 years old now. An extensive network of more than 60 outposts and access points across Africa. Some are currently being utilized, some are held in reserve, some are shuttered. But you've got quite a few places here where we've been involved. This was from 2002 to 2015. So look at that, all into the Sahel and all in towards Central Africa. Places, of course, which have seen not only a delightful amount of civil conflict, various forms of Islamic terrorism, and, of course, foreign direct investment from the Chinese and Russians. And that's something that I thought would be pertinent for us to take a look at. And then there's a more recent one that I'm going to share this instead. And this is from an article later on. It's also in the 2015 area. But this is just in this little area that we're covering right now. So we got Al-Qaeda, the Islamic Maghreb, we've got Boko Haram. And then, of course, we've got U.S. military presence. We have the French military presence in Mali and Gao, but they're also present in Niger. The Agadez has a drone base that we still use to this day, although, of course, that's made things a little more difficult. These numbers are certainly a little older than what they are now, but U.S. fighter jets and troops are in this region, and we're predominantly interested in maintaining it. Of course, there's Benin and Togo right there. Those are former German colonies. And they're thankfully getting past the ECOWAS sanctions, so they can still receive oil in from oil pipelines, because they also have an ongoing relationship with PetroChina. It's invested heavily in the two former African German colonies. So, these are important things, I think, to keep in consideration. And then one more little graphic here, and then I can sort of bring this all to a front as to what I want to get towards here. Because, we have the anti-terrorist movements, all these desires to sort of like keep a clamp down on things. And then there we go. I'll share this one instead. Share this tab. So, you've got this just massive amount of growth from 2001 to 2021 in just 20 years, 10 or more personnel. But I mean, even from there, just in, South Africa, Egypt, towards the Western Sahara, as well as right there on top, like, now we're everywhere. And the great game is alive and well in the both in the Sahel, but also in Africa. And as the former ambassador wrote, this is a very important region, not just because we're talking about oil, not just because we're talking about counterterrorism or uranium, but I think as our mutual friend Morgoth likes to say, we have what's known as Morgoth's Law, that anytime there's some kind of disaster or civil war, that usually leads to migrants coming in towards towards Europe, and also by extension, the United States. And he writes this, I'm just going to quote him directly. Perhaps more urgent than even natural gas in the Sahel's rose in the burgeoning human trafficking trade. In 2016, a full 50% of migrants who reached Italy had transited through the northern Niger town of Agadez, the same site of the famous American anti-jihadist drone base. Europe's reaction to migrant flows from Africa are, to be diplomatic, complicated. While there is a strong unrestricted migration lobby, particularly among elites, there is also a multi-billion euro efforts to manage and stanch the flow. Sahel countries facing Western sanctions are far less likely to bother to stop migration flows and intend and will seek profit from them. He finishes off by saying, it seems that the concern about migration among European elites is less about its intrinsic worth or risks about the fear that it's too much migration too soon could drive European politics in right-wing populist directions, an eventuality that bureaucrats fear even more than floods of Africans and Arabs arriving on their shores. And he's got us a map from Africa to Europe that deals with migration routes. And I'm going to bring that image up here, share this tab instead. And so you can see right there out of Agadez in Niger, you've got places heading towards ports, towards the East African coastal highway that they can go all around here, and up to places like the Western Sahara, as well as in towards Morocco, and of course Algeria as well. So there you go. Cross right around the Mediterranean, the Strait of Gibraltar, go into Malta, head into Italy, find your way in Germany or another part of there. So any form of conflict that we're going to see out of this area, whether it's just sanctions or small border skirmishes, or even, full weight of the U.S. military or even the French military, expect to see this, only get worse. And I think that's a really important thing to consider when this issue is being discussed. Because, these are the things that we're going to be dealing with as this conflict goes on. Is there? Yeah.
I just wanted to say nobody should worry about anything, because there's a U.S. Department of State dispatch, and it is from today.
All right.
A little bit earlier today, and it says, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Molly Fee will travel to Nigeria, Chad, and Ghana from August 25th to the 29th. During this trip, she will engage with regional heads of state to discuss U.S. support for ECOWAS and regional leadership in responding to the crisis in Niger. In Chad, she will review ongoing developments with neighbors, Niger and Sudan, as well as Chad's political transition. Remember, Chad is where the son of the previous strongman seized power with the support of the military. So there, the U.S. is helping with that transition. In all her conversations, I can only imagine that when Mali shows up to explain this to all the African warlords, they'll all listen to her frank and constructive remarks. In all her conversations, she will raise the shared goals of preserving Niger's hard-earned democracy and achieving the immediate release of President Bazoum, his family, and those members of his government unjustly detained. She will also be consulting with senior officials in Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Togo, emphasizing U.S. support for the principled stand taken by ECOWAS in defense of democracy and constitutional order. Mind you, the whole idea of democracy in this region is such a howling obscenity of a joke that it taxes one's credulity. So
yeah, I'm very curious to see how it goes, but I don't imagine it'll go any better, because as soon as this, a lot of the coup had taken place, we had it was only at the end of July, I think it was the 27th, he was ousted. But they had the secretary to the devil himself, Victoria Nuland, visit with the coup leaders. This was from Politico on August 7th of this month and of this year. And she was there, had a 2-hour meeting in Niger's capital, Niamey, with the leaders of the military takeover. And this is from Politico. Speaking with the junta leaders, Nuland said that it was absolutely clear the kinds of support that we will legally have to cut off if democracy is not restored. If the U.S. determines that a democratically elected government has been toppled by unconstitutional means, federal law requires a cutoff of American assistance, particularly military aid. She also stressed the U.S. concern for the welfare of the president, Mohamed Bazoum, who she said is being detained with his wife and son. The meeting was with General Moussa Salah Barmou, a U.S.-trained officer, and 3 of the colonels involved in the takeover. The coup's top leader, former presidential guard head, I'm not even going to try and pronounce his first name, Tichani, did not meet with the Americans. So, again, you're speaking to intermediaries. The head of this junta and leadership is not going to be speaking. So right now it seems that if it didn't work with the assistant, to the devil himself, then we're going to just send someone else to casually charm up support with
Mali.
ECOWAS. Yeah, in Mali, where we do have a strong military presence. So
sorry. I had reference to Mali, our friend, the assistant deputy, whatever. Yeah, Mali.
Okay,
she's
glad to know she's
going to
not
carry
going.
It home.
Yeah, maybe she'll get a home run while she's out there. But
let's not hold our breath. So did you see this business? France denies reported asked Algeria to use airspace for a Niger operation. This is from 2 or 3 days ago. France's army on Tuesday denied it had asked Algeria to use its airspace for a military operation in Niger, after an Algerian state radio report late on Monday said such permission had been refused. To me, that seems as though Algeria is basically making a nuisance of itself as far as France is concerned. I have my own suspicions that Algeria and Algerian intelligence services working with Algerian organized crime in France are probably behind the riots that paralyzed the country for a couple of months, just a month or 2 back here. Algeria is basically flexing in reference to France to a certain extent. And now Mali, Niger, Guinea, and the rest are coming on board. Let's see what happens with Chad. And Libya certainly isn't stable. So this entire area could become quite a mess.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see where it goes. I think one of the other things that I think we're also looking at it, and I don't mean to say this in like that weird academic sense of like, well, we're looking at this through a Western lens. I mean, we are, but I mean, the other thing that I think is kind of interesting to consider is that one of the players that is the last time I talked about like African affairs on the Old Glory Club, someone had said, well, you should look into Japan and see what they're doing in here. And I know that they have they have a conference which is about the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. I think they're hosting another one in 2025. But they are also a large humanitarian investor there. They had a conference last year. This was back when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was still alive, although at the time it was Prime Minister Kishida Fumio, who was Prime Minister Abe's former defense minister and worked very well in foreign affairs. It's been around for over 30 years now, and their focus, of course, is on domestic and international relations between them, how they can work on developing energy and providing food security. It usually has 21 to 50 diplomats, officials, heads of state. The last time I was reading about it was that the announcement that Japan was doing was going to be investing 30 billion USD in both public and private investment to train in healthcare, human security, and anti-trafficking initiatives for training 300,000 African officials in the next 3 years. So, from 2022 to 2023, or 2025, I guess we'll see whether or not that goes. But I'm really glad that gentleman had, told me to look into that, because it was something to really consider. I had no idea how much of a great game or an effort that Japan had been making inside of Africa in this diplomatic sense. I was really keen to sort of disregard it or ignore it because, Japan's got its own issues with its population. I mean, Prime Minister Kishida earlier this year had said, listen, if we don't do something about our birth rates, our country stops existing in terms of defense and basic infrastructure. So again, to see them trying to do similar things to what China does, where, they'll invest, they'll try and train, but China's far less likely to, outsource their labor. And with they barely do localization in Kazakhstan and places like that. So I can't imagine them doing much in Africa with that respect for reasons of competency and security. But yeah, it was something to consider, that there was a lot of Japan or a Japanese presence in here, which I think is really interesting to consider, that they're also involved in this part for humanitarian and economic development.
Yeah, another one to throw in there is Turkey. Turkey has signed military-related pacts with the majority of the countries in Africa, and it's mostly in East and West Africa. And they have two bases, one in Tajura and another one in Misrata in Libya. As I've said, they're heavily involved in the civil war there, fighting against the Haftar group on behalf of the Government of National Unity and Italian and U.S.-backed side of things. Wagner, Russia, Egypt, and France and several other Arab countries are on the side of the East Libyans. So the Turks have two training base, maritime training base, and a infantry, presumably training base or special operations or something in Libya. They've also got a training base in Somalia. To your point of talking about some of these other countries that are sort of have something of a finger in the pie. The Ottomans, of course, had possessions in Libya and other North African coastal regions. Ataturk, before he rose to fame with the World War I and the independence of Turkey, was dispatched to North Africa to deal with problems there in what's now Libya. So the Turks are involved, but Erdogan has apparently announced publicly that he does not support an ECOWAS military intervention there. This makes sense, though. He's a Muslim, and the powers that be in the Sahel region are Muslim. If not entirely, then the overwhelming majority, certainly. One last thing to point out is that in terms of the north-south access, like with energy pipelines that you talked about, because Algeria has so heavily swung over to the side of Russia of late, Morocco is really trying to come in and attract investment from the West and U.S. support. When I was coming back from a recent trip, I was on the plane with a physician from Morocco, and he was talking to me quite a bit about all the Western investment, how Morocco and Algeria are now kind of at loggerheads, and the West is trying to come in there. So as you'll see with those proposed energy routes on the map that you pulled up earlier, some of them are now being conceived of as exiting to the port facilities via Morocco rather than Algeria. So the Morocco-Algeria thing, in terms of access here for energy that would come up through that area, is another sort of variable to throw in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's an important one to consider because, Turkey is just as involved in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. They have their own particular investment. They have a large educational and diplomatic, and I think is a military presence as well. And this is their own way of playing the sort of migrant diplomacy that President Erdogan has been well renowned for doing in that respect. And I was reading, I was just reading earlier, like that you had said that he has no desire to have the ECOWAS get involved. And there's a good graphic, I think, for us to put up on this issue because of this coup, they've already cut them off. So, you have the darker orange suspended or sanctioned after a coup. And would you look at that, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, the ones that we've seen recent military coups in the past, but also the three, major countries that Turkey is heavily invested in. And they are quite interested in not wanting to lose their own holdings. And there was a report that was written by Dalia Gehenim, and she works at the European Institute for Mediterranean Affairs, or European Institute of the Mediterranean. She studies these affairs. And she was, she did a great report earlier this year, sort of unraveling Turkey's interest in the Sahel. And a lot of it, of course, is one based on Islam. And of course, there's this anti-Turkish slant to it, calling, Erdogan a neo-Ottomanism, having a rightful eye to sort of more Islamic world politics. But, a lot of Turkish involvement and motivations in the Sahel has been for a more multi-regional, use of Islamic diplomacy, especially since the, Arab Spring in 2011. How do you sort of keep Islamism as a way to maintain firm diplomatic relations? And those countries, of course, between radical, terror groups that may or may not be supported by the U.S. I mean, there are numerous ones that have been listed, whether it's the Islamic State, Boko Haram, there are numerous other smaller cells as well. But, there's a lot of desire to produce trade in the region as well. She writes that foreign trade accounts for almost 50% of all Turkish GDP, making it crucial to a functioning Turkish economy. In the last decade, there has been an increase in trade flows and investment between Turkey and Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Over the years, Ankara has meticulously built an image as a reliable trade partner that comes without the political baggage and is not interested in depth trap diplomacy. It is a strategy that pays off. Trade relations with Turkey are described by the Sahelian interviewees as sincere, equally, and mutually respectful, which clearly contrasts with the opinions on their relationship with instance in comparison to France. With the help of the Turkish government, Turkish companies are encouraged to invest in Sahel countries and Africa in general. However, there are contradictions because things in Burkina Faso aren't as fair as they are in Niger, and so on and so forth. And I thought that was a rather interesting little report. But because those three countries aren't there in the group because of their coups and because of their relationship to Islamic groups, well, look at that, Of course, Turkey doesn't want ECOWAS to get involved, and whereas the French and the U.S. are kind of pushing for this group to have a restoring of the democratic elected order and to make sure that aid isn't cut off. And the French foreign minister had already said, listen, if you kick us out, uranium prices won't just go up for us, they will go up worldwide, causing, a greater economic concern for nuclear energy. And I think neither of us need to be reminded of the fact, that our audience may, that out of all of the Western European countries, France is still the most heavily nuclearized in terms of domestic energy production. So, whether uranium for nuclear weapons or trying to get access to uranium for other means, for for military technologies as well as for energy production, those are kind of things that you want access to and that you don't want, say, your geopolitical rivals like Russia, like China, to have sole, almost monopoly-like access to. So, I mean, there's a much greater game is being played here, and all it takes is one little coup to set things off. And I think that we know what happens when one little coup sets things off, especially when you're close to a more, larger geopolitical power, like when you oust a leader in Ukraine and see what happens.
Indeed. And the way in which these coups have just sort of, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, you just see it running like a wall between north and south from the Atlantic coast and moving inward and westward. And we know that there's a civil war going on in Sudan, as we've talked about, that arguably Wagner has some participation in, at least in an advisory capacity. But from everything I've read about it, it should not be understood that Wagner is backing one faction or another. They seem very flexible. They just want to be with whomever it is that comes out on top. And the business of a base on the Red Sea that Russia wants to set up should be compared with the Djibouti bases of the United States and China in the same region. And the whole mummers farce of piracy, all this business of the terrible pirates that just can't be controlled, which to me seem to be all about ensuring that shipping is not secure along this route, because it's one that very much serves the global south, so to speak, Russia and China as well. More so, for example, than it necessarily does the U.S. and the Atlantic powers. But that's just a suspicion of mine. So we've got Guinea that fell, which is just south, of course, of what's here being called the Sahel. But Guinea fell, and then Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Sudan is already being contested and is a failed state at present. We've got all kinds of warnings about how the civil war going on there threatens to engulf, surrounding regions as well. So it's really Chad is this one that, and of course Sudan has to be sorted. But if Sudan were sorted in Russia's favor, Chad would be the last link in the chain. And how hard would it be to get involved with doing things in Chad when Libya is currently off the board? Or it's not a fixed position, it's contested, right? Much in the same way that Sudan currently is. If these things get brought together again, I think you're going to see a wall here, and it's going to be a wall that could cut off human trafficking flows to the north, could increase them much further. That could block the flow of resources north, and could wrest a great deal of power from the French. So the question for me really is, who benefits from all this? What are the competing parties? And the one thing that I feel fairly sure of, given the example of Libya, people like Haftar that we talked about, I mean, you've literally got a UN-backed government, at least superficially, in the west of Libya, and it's backed by Italy and several different major oil concerns, and the UN and the US and Turkey. And then over on the other side of Libya, you've got France and Egypt, and I think it's the United Arab Emirates, maybe Qatar, and Wagner forces and Russia, fighting in this one country. So what the hell, So I believe you probably see things like, whatever the big Italian national petroleum concern and investment is, or whatever kind of group it's a part of, at loggerheads with Total or whatever the French concerns are. It's a very tangled mess here, and nation states, I think, have less to do with it than economic concerns, with the exception of the U.S., which just wants to come in and establish its control over everything. Not that it won't then farm it right out to the different economic concerns, but in the U.S.'s case, it's a very puzzling mess, and I'm not sure that we can simply say that it's this country versus this country, or this block versus that block. But in some cases, it is.
No, I think that you're actually onto a good point here, because there is something to certainly look at with respects to, we're looking at a sort of this almost not like an island chain, but like a nation chain of countries that either have had in the past a strong relationship with its former colonial government, which would be the French, or has had a stronger U.S. military relationship in that respect towards here. So, for instance, in the ongoing conflict in Sudan, you've seen millions displaced. There has been the fight between the rapid response forces versus the actual Sudanese military. It has like 3.5 million people displaced. 500,000 of them have gone over to Chad. But the other thing that is sort of interesting to realize, and I was reading this, I pulled up an article from the Washington Post, but it was from April of this year. And of course, its concern was about the ongoing attacks inside of Chad. And it said that the Central African country has been one of the most important security partners in the region, confronted by Russian influence versus, I'll just share this tab, versus Russian influence in several Islamic insurgencies. So I think this is the interesting thing to get to, however, is, let me see if I can find it, the Chadian government. Rebellion is woven into the history of Chad, a sprawling nation of 16 million that is home to dozens of ethnic groups vying for power. President Idris Deby, who was fatally wounded on the battlefield in 2021, I wish our guys would do that, tamped down multiple rebellions during his 30-year reign, sometimes with the support of Chad's former colonizer, France. Chad has been led by Deby's son, General Mohammed Idris Deby Intino, since 2021. Of course, this is where the discussion over Russia's involvement is, and PMC Wagner. But the French popularity falling, I think, is certainly interesting to consider. You have this sort of chain of French dissatisfaction over just over former colonizer. We already saw how, because of migrants, the killing of an Algerian, inside of France by the cops, they kind of had their own Floyd moment like we saw in 2020. And, it makes hard to play diplomacy with your former colonial territories, as they have this, ethnic blood libel revenkist attitude towards your own government, your own people that aren't even yours, right? And so to see this play out, you have, we'll go back to that graphic here, right? So you have Sudan, which is mired in war, which already has its own issues in relationship to the United States because it's more friendly with Egypt, and alongside trying to keep pressure on Ethiopia, because there's a lot of Chinese investment in these three countries as well, alongside Eritrea, but primarily between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt over the Grand Renaissance Dam. Sudan is in the midst of civil war, and it is fighting currently over energy and food, and is also one of the largest recipients of the United Nations World Food Program, which happens to have most of its grain for the World Food Program come from Ukraine and Russia. How interesting. And then on top of that, 500,000 refugees into Chad, ongoing, ethnic, religious, and political disputes there with the growth of French unpopularity, military bases inside Chad. You've now just seen a coup take place in Niger. Don't want Americans involved. Get your troops and drones out. Get the French out. And then, of course, Mali, and then Senegal has also seen some stuff alongside Guinea. So all these things sort of play out in a rather interesting block to sort of cut off these Sahel and also soon to be, Central African territories that have received a lot of foreign direct investment. And, maybe you'll find a way to disrupt, say, migrant flows, energy flows, trade, rare earth minerals, alongside America's own anti-terror organizations and its growth of troops there. I mean, we've during the Trump administration, you famously had the special forces that were killed in Mali during their own operations, and it's very rare for Americans to sort of ask the question, "Hey, we've got guys in Africa," because again, it's kept relatively secret, as we discussed.
Yeah, there was it might have been in Niger, or there was a second one.
I think there was,
but I believe there was one in Niger as well. A last thing to point out here, or a further thing to point out, is that there's this article, and it is from
it was in Niger, not Mali. You're right.
There's one from today saying Chad all but deprived of trade routes after Niger coup. Imports bound for Chad have been blocked in Benin since Niger's borders were shut after the recent coup there. So when Niger shut its borders,
this is Benin, by the way, where my cursor is for the audience. That's
yes.
Benin.
And so that means, as they write here, this means Chad has lost a fourth major trade route after conflict in Libya and in Sudan to stop the flow of goods. And so now Chad is attempting to boost its Cameroonian channel. But if we go take a look, Russia has a military base in Central African Republic, and reportedly quite a bit of Wagner involvement there. And if we take a look here at an article from 2023, January 18th, the Africa Report, which is definitely a pro-Western kind of resource, but it says, from gold to coffee, wood to spirits, the Russian group Wagner has made the Central African Republic and Cameroon the backbone of a network of companies whose profits are worth millions of euros. Here's our investigation into the heart of the Wagner multinational. But basically, the relevant point here is they write, thanks to contacts in Cameroon, the port of Douala has become the hub of their commercial operations. They hope to expand their activities there. So Russia has a base in the Central African Republic. Russia has bases in Libya, or at least access to bases in Libya in the east. And they're heavily set up in Cameroon. And now the coup in Niger means that Chad has been cut off from one of its major routes. Libya isn't solid either. Sudan isn't solid either. So Niger, the border's cut. Libya, the border is highly problematic due to ongoing war. Sudan, the border is highly problematic due to ongoing war. Maybe they could do things with Nigeria. I'm not sure about the infrastructure in that region, but it comes down to Cameroon, where the Russians have a heavy influence, and that's a route for them. I cannot escape the feeling that there really is something going on, and that Russia at least is trying to play some role in what's unfolding there. And as I said earlier, I would mention the name of this French resource. Now, his stuff I've only seen available in French. But he is quite an expert on goings-on in Africa from a French perspective. His name is Bernard Lugan, 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 Bernard Lugan, and you can find him online.
I'll have to look him up for sure in that respect. But I think it's interesting now because of the, Prigozhin news, that there was a statement by the Russian Ministry of Defense saying that, like, effective, there is no legal entity known as, Wagner PMC. So, whether or not that, whatever happens with that group, it seems to effectively kind of cut under the knees rhetorically for, Secretary of State Antony Blinken to use them as sort of this perpetual boogeyman for policy in the Sahel and Central Africa. Because if, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian state's going to just take him over and listen to Machiavelli's advice on mercenaries, then it's going to be a little hard, I suppose, for them to maintain it. Or maybe things will change, but everything's in flux right now. But I do think it's kind of interesting to sort of see where we're at, playing out here. Because, again, you have conflict in almost every single one of these countries. You have an ongoing grab for resources between the United States, France, and places like China and Russia. Of course, Turkey and Japan are also heavily interested in this region as well. And then on top of that, we're going to impose sanctions and the border is closed. So again, whether or not ECOWAS does anything, I think that will heavily depend on the political capital of French President Emmanuel Macron and the United States' his own, politics. And who knows? I mean, one of the things that I find particularly interesting is that the ECOWAS delegation to Niamey was the new U.S. ambassador to Niger, her name is Kathleen Fitzgibbon. So we wish her the best of luck in this efforts. But the ECOWAS had made a condemnation statement earlier this month. And Nigeria, of course, has its, I think the president of Nigeria and his top presidential advisor, who I mentioned on Pete Quinones' channel, the name escapes me. They're the sort of chairman nation for this term of ECOWAS, and it's going to really depend on what they do and their relationship to, say, France or the United States. So I think that these are things that we're going to have to keep a really close eye on in the next 6 months to a year and a half, because as more and more foreign direct investment comes in here, as we've seen the massive 20-year plus buildup of American military infrastructure in Africa, that this part of the world is not going to go away, especially as countries look towards resource extraction and trying to bypass the already existing means and mechanisms of, trade relations and sanctions. I mean, we've talked about it on this channel with you before, Semiogogue. We talked about like the Straits of Malacca. We've talked about, these mechanisms in which China's relationship with, like, say, Afghanistan and the, Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor. We're really getting to see all these, we're seeing feelers, and we're seeing a lot of investment being put in for alternative routes and resource and diplomatic relations, which means bodies for, defense or collective military action, that they can supply with, weapons, materials, or resources and intelligence, and act as they so wish. I think that, the scramble for Africa, or the Great Game 2.0 in the African continent, has really only just begun this century after decolonialization took place in the 20th.
Yeah, I would add one last little tidbit is that, the business with the Ukraine grain deal and the ability to export grain to the starving nations of the global south who are so dependent on that economic aid. We can definitely see, I believe anyway, a proactive, anticipatory narrative framing. I mean, don't forget that this coup in Niger happened like literally within days after Russia's Africa summit. Yeah. And we've got the stuff with BRICS going on now. It looks like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, among others, are going to be admitted. Of course, South Africa is a member. But the point here is, I believe that Russia has designs in Africa, obviously, and Russia wants to do things there. And what they're doing with these landlocked Sahel states, you have to think about, Russia as a land power, and you're well aware of all of this stuff with Spickman and Mackinder and, the Heartland and, the Rimland and the naval powers, or you can take it back to the old ideas with Thucydides, with the Athenians and their league versus the Spartans, right? The idea that the naval powers can choke you off with sea access. And so whenever you hear the Russians talking about the grain stuff and, doing their Africa summits and the rest, they really do reach out to these countries. They really do attempt to push diplomacy there. And there really is a strong native sense of frustration with, French colonial stuff that's been going on. And so I guess the easiest way to say it is that I believe I see an anticipatory, proactive narrative being crafted whereby any attempt to blockade this emerging group of cooperating nations, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and probably in the future Chad, and probably Sudan at some point. Any attempt to blockade them, which is the obvious way that North Atlantic naval powers would cut off their access and paralyze them, which is what we always do whenever we can do it. There's already a narrative crafted about getting food to the third world and Russian access through the Black Sea to get their grain exports out, because there are so many people in Africa who are hungry. And we've seen that Putin has gone out and made statements. Look, all these countries that are worried about how they might not be able to get grain because of what's going on in Ukraine, we're just here to tell you, we're just going to give it to you for free. Yep. So you see, I believe that this narrative is designed to dovetail with attempts to, just because of raw power politics, blockade this emerging group of countries. But now they can't do that without the story already being that they're preventing the arrival of food to these starving multitudes, which will then serve the purpose of further inflaming their concerns and driving anti-colonialist sentiment and rhetoric. Just another thing I thought I would throw in there.
No, I think that that's right on point, and I think that you got to look at right where we it's said that Chad is this like large military place, that there's a lot of importance there in the Lake Chad region, which is vitally important for Cameroon, Nigeria, Niger, and Chad. And well, look at where we have, and I'm just going to put it right there on the map. I'll share this instead. And look where we tend to have our military base right there in the same city, right outside. and that's where we have a military training presence. We have drones that are stationed there as well. And so, I think that this is a key thing to look at in that respect. And I know Jay Brulham is saying that, Russia doesn't have a need for resources. No, but places like China especially does. And if the Chinese-Russian relationship is going to be maintained for any course of time, the stronger that those two are economically, and the stronger that you have a political formula based off decolonialization, the stronger that your relationship is going to become in trade and investment. The big thing that you really need to look at with respect to Russia and resources here is just the World Food Program. And that's the thing that I would really want to consider. But yeah, like there's the Lake Chad, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad. That's a vital resource. That's something to keep in mind. But yeah, I definitely think, go for it.
May I add one quick point? I think Jay Brulham, the point he's making here, though, is very interesting and causes my brain to kind of fire off, because the Chinese have an increasingly crappy reputation in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, there are people in these countries that have had enough to do with them and their predatory their predatory activities. And I'm not saying that ours aren't worse, but bottom line is the Africans can spot a Chinese guy coming, and they know what's probably going to be coming along with them, right? Predatory loans, resource extraction, and all the rest. Again, not saying that they're any worse than we are. But with the Russians, there is a long historical tradition of support in that area. So to kind of take your point about China cooperating with Russia and that ongoing relationship, Prude, as well as this Jay Brulham gentleman's point, it works for everybody. Certainly for the Chinese, for the Russians to be the front men for a new phase of development and logistical development and, treaties, cooperation, all the rest.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. Like, you want to control resource pathways, and we're already talking about a trans-Sahelian highway system. There's going to be more development being invested in here in respects to Chad looks like a face. Yeah, this is where the meme comes from, gentlemen. This is how his face is carved, but I'll let y'all make that connection on your own. This is where you want to make, controlling a way where there's both a western, east-west connection where you have access to the Red Sea all the way down to the Atlantic is going to be a great way to sort of control where trade flows through. You're going to be able to pay duties. You're going to be able to collect, taxes and duties off of, say, oil and things like that. To me, this just seems to be the great way in which you're going to control how much influence the United States or France or any other former European territory has in extracting resources. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I think that we're going to see this sort of, conflict over diplomatic relations, which government is friendly with who, which, currency is trading in the yuan or the ruble or the dollar, the euro. Those things are going to show themselves because, again, I think that there's going to be a scramble for Africa 2.0, and it's going to look a lot different in the name of, say, military governance, decolonialization, democracy, and liberalism. These sort of things are going to play a large role in the future. And again, I think Turkey will be a player in it as well, because what can you leverage? You can leverage religion, which is one of the biggest motivating things that, attracts an identity in these territories, which is Islam. So, yeah, I mean, I think that Brilliant makes a good point, but certainly true for us to consider.
No argument here.
Yeah.
I'm very interested to see where all of this goes. Yeah.
Well, yeah, like I said, I think that you definitely want to pay attention to this place for the next 6 months to the next year and a half. I just think that we're going to be reviewing this place in the future. I see ourselves coming back. And Mr. D is in the chat. Hello, Mr. D.
The mighty D.
The mighty D.
He's after you too. He's
I know
he's trying to hook you straight in.
Yeah. He wants that.
Well,
Twitter
for my
space.
part, I will be joining him, as I'm a real friend. I'm a real friend. The people who don't join,
I'll be there. I'll be there. But shall we go to the super chat, see what the questions are, and then we will go straight into promotions and wrap up.
Excellent. Charlemagne in
Okay.
the house too, man.
Yeah,
All the
look at
star
that.
power.
All the star powers here tonight. All right, so we're going to get started from the Mad Mercenary for $5 Australian. Great work, sir. He says, before the war, Ukraine was 50% of all grain in the WEF, or maybe the World Food Program. Now it's 80%. I wonder what would make Ukraine a primary supplier to poor nations. Well, I think because Ukraine is like one of the breadbaskets of Europe. It has some of the most fertile soil in the eastern part of the European continent. Both Ukraine and Russia were the largest grain exporters for the United Nations World Food Program. And when the war started, there were like a million pieces that were talking about the concern over famine. And that, initially there was a grain deal about getting grain out of the Black Sea and out of Turkey and out of the Bosphorus and making sure it would go to where it's been. And I think Russia recently reneged on that. And I don't know if they're still treating everything that goes into the Black Sea as an enemy combatant. I'd imagine that they are, but yeah, I mean,
I think they're inspecting ships. They're demanding they stop for inspection, but it doesn't seem to be all of them. And they had this sort of they had their resolve tested by a ship refusing to stop, and they brought a gunboat up alongside it and boarded it. But now apparently they're trying to do things closely down the coast in territorial waters controlled by NATO or EU nations, basically along the coastline of Bulgaria and Romania. And sorry, just...
No, that's good. I didn't know that part, so it's good to know. But yeah, I mean, it's got some of the most fertile soil in Eastern Europe. Machiavelli Sucks to Go for $4.99 says, wasn't so-called colonialism a response to African pirates in the 1700s and 1800s? Partially. For instance, the Barbary states that America took out, it was, part of a trade route for white slavery that had over 3 million or over 1.5 million people over 300 years. So I wouldn't be surprised, but I mean, colonialism depends on how you want to define colonialism / imperialism, but definitely a response, but for security, sovereignty, and defeating the heathen, right? I mean, when America went to war with the Barbary states, the Pope blessed a very Protestant Anglo country saying, hey, thanks for the good work. So partially a response to it, but also at the same time, resources and money to be gained. Plus, trade is still active there. So things to consider.
Dirty heathens.
Dirty heathens. End of history for $4.99 says, try getting Colonel Chris Wyatt on a future stream. Conscious Caracal interviewed him twice on Africa. He also has a YouTube channel and is based. Yeah, no, whoever Conscious Caracal brings on is usually a good guy to talk to. So I'll look into him and see if I can. Thanks so much. Mad Mercenary for $2 Australian just says, greetings, gentlemen. Well, thank you. Glad that you're here. Greatly appreciate it. The End of History for $1.99. Well, history keeps on going, but we appreciate your donation. Homerus Lupercal, War Master of the Every Green Terax. You have called and I have answered. Scrotchy is no more. I have ascended to my final form where I make cringe, lowbrow, right-wing podcasts. Well, I'm glad that you changed your name to something much longer, although Scrotchy McDumpwaffle was always fun to read when you gave money. But enjoy lowbrow, right-wing podcasting, good sir. It's a lot of fun. I highly get into it. It's a lucrative business. Everyone does it. And then there were a few more from Entropy that I'm going to get into. Jonathan Gordon for $15 US says, this is the content I'm subscribed for. Well, thank you, Jonathan. I try my best to get good people on to talk about what's going on in the world. And then Daniel Robinson for $5 US says, China really can't scale in Africa. It's mainly a worker program for Chinese labor. But Japan already does this and will likely scale. This is him telling me to look at the TCAD stuff again. Okay. And Japan already has tons of projects, and in the 80s were the biggest providers of African aid. Well, that was the 80s, but I'd have to do more research. Like I said, after you mentioned it on the OGC stream, I started reading about the last TCAD conference. And I didn't really know that they had that big of an influence back in the 80s, but I wonder how much of that's changed in relation to China's investment, but also they're more focused, I think, geographically near the proximity of the home country. So, but good to know. And I mean, we'll see in 2025, right? But that, I believe, is all of the super chats. So your donations are always greatly appreciated. It allows the show to keep on going, and it's a great way for you to participate and ask questions. So, Mr. Semiogogue, where can people find you? What are you working on, and what are you doing?
People can find me, thanks for asking, over on my YouTube channel, Semiogogue. And you can find me over on Odyssey under the same name, BitChute as well. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Telegram. In terms of what's coming up next, I have some things in the works, but they are not scheduled yet. So I will keep it on the down low, as the saying goes, until I get it scheduled. But usually I do weekly streams. I've been a bit busy lately with traveling and other things, but I hope to get it back together here soon. So yes, nothing specific to announce in the upcoming future, but anyone who might be interested, because it means so much, can go over and on any one of my videos over on my channel, you can find my books. I don't expect that anyone will be interested in poetry, but this is Cinders from the Bloomery of Youth, which you can find the link for over on my channel. You can buy it on Amazon under the name Oliver Timken Perrin. And there is my sci-fi book from the year 2076, set in a dystopian future Istanbul, where the protagonist, our hero, Alaric McBroom, is in pursuit of a particular rare book as remorseless corporate hitmen and an esoteric sect of assassins try to kill him. It's called Vinculum. It's a little bit cyberpunky. You can find the link for that over on Amazon as well. Buy my books, buy books now. It means so much.
I can
and
definitely.
Thanks very, very much for having me.
Oh, yeah, anytime. You're one of my favorite people to talk to on geopolitical stuff. You have a good eye for the maps and big pictures. And I can recommend his science fiction book. I own a copy. I've read it. I was like looking for my bookshelf so I could quickly grab it, because I usually have it on hand to shield my friends and their good work. But it's well worth your time. It's well worth a read. Highly recommend that you go ahead and buy a book. His links are down below in the description to his YouTube channel, Telegram, findmyfriends.net. Be sure to give our friend a warm welcome and round of support and a subscription if you haven't done so already. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will hopefully have a video out sometime next week. And if you're on Twitter, we'll probably be on Mr. D's spaces relatively soon. But once again, Oliver, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you to the audience for your ongoing support. I thought this was a good discussion on just what the heck is going on in Africa, not just Niger, but also just the sort of greater geopolitical picture in the Sahel. So with that, we'll see you later.